Hello everyone, this is Mrinal. In this video, we are going to look into functions. We are going to answer three basic questions: why, what, and how. That is, why do I need to study functions? Why do I need to know about functions? And after I have explained why, then we will move over to what is a function. So we'll talk about the syntax and everything, basic advantages and disadvantages, and in how we will actually look into the syntax and also show you a very simple example of how to use a function and how to even call it, right? So let's jump into our Jupyter notebook and we'll see a piece of code. Now in here you can see there is a very small program that is being written, and now it is just for the demonstration purpose, so maybe this example might seem a bit naive, but stay with me. So in here a simple program is being written where we take two numbers a and b, then perform different kind of arithmetic operations on it: addition, division, multiplication, and subtraction. Now what will happen if I execute it? So obviously it's going to ask me for the first number, so I'll just enter 10, second number to be 20, and as we can see, all the operations, because it's we know that a normal Python program has a linear execution. That is, it will start from the very top and it will keep on executing all the lines till the end of the program is being reached. So that's why we have all the values: the sum, the division, the multiplication, and even the subtraction. Now the interesting thing is that if you think it to be a calculator program, how a calculator behaves, now it's not like you enter two numbers into a calculator and all the arithmetic operations gets executed. That is not the way. What actually happens when we use a calculator, and we are all aware of it, that we enter two numbers, and based on the operation key that we press, a particular operation gets executed, right? So that is where the idea of functions come into existence. Now what we can do for the sake of convenience, that we can group this piece of code, right, these piece of code together and make a small group of statements out of it, which is being obviously called function, and we can use it based on our own wish. If we want, we can just call it and then get it executed, or if we don't want, you can just not call it and get done with the other function. So that is the basic benefit of function. That is, it helps you to group a very large piece of code into small fragments and allows you to use it over and over again. So that is one of the benefits. Another benefit that I can right away say is that, you see here, you can see that the two numbers are being asked and all other operations has been based on these two numbers. At certain times in a program, you might not want that. You might want to have, you see, sum or addition between two numbers and a division between a different set of two numbers, right? So in this kind of a layout, we don't have a mechanism, but functions, with the help of an idea called a parameters, right, we can put in some arguments, that means actual numbers or any kind of an object, and the operations will be performed on it. So that is yet another benefit. So the basic idea is that when a very big program is being given, it's always better to divide it into different modules, and obviously there are different advantages to it, and that is where functions come into existence. Does it make sense? So that was the idea behind functions. So whenever you have a very big program, bifurcate it, divide it into small groups, and based on your requirement, you can just simply call it, right? So that was all about why do I need a function. So in our blog post, we have given a very small paragraphs about how it actually gets executed and what is the reason behind it, right? So the next question that we are going to answer is, what is a function in a Python programming language? Now in very simple definition, I would say that a function is a named unit of a group of program statements. That means we can just take this particular group of statement and call it a name, maybe sum or add, whatever you want to, and then call it. So that is the idea behind function. A function is nothing but a named group of statements. Number of statements are being grouped, given a name, and they are being called, right? So that is the basic idea behind it. And obviously there is another part that is called invoking. So that means a function never gets executed unless and until it is called. Does it make sense? So imagine it's like a New Year's functions or a Christmas Eve. So we know what are the statements or what are the job that has to be done in a New Year's Eve or a Christmas function, but unless and until we call it, that is okay, on this particular day we will celebrate a New Year's Eve, or this particular day we are going to celebrate Christmas, or on this particular day we are going to celebrate our birthday, whatever kind of a function we want to celebrate, unless and until we call that, that function doesn't get executed, right? So that is the idea behind calling it. And obviously in our how section we will talk about the syntax as well as how the function will be called and invoked, right? So here is a list of advantages, and we also have some disadvantages that we are going to discuss. The first idea is modularity. That means a program or a big program with the help of function can be divided into different modules. Modules means basically you see a group of statements and use it on our basis, on our need basis, right? So if we want that particular module to work, we can. If we don't want, we will not use that. Now complexity, now as the program is being divided into smaller parts, so that's why complexity gets reduced. Because imagine you want to change or implement a new feature in your code. Now if your entire code is written, maybe it's like 10,000 lines of code and everything is written in one single script, it becomes very tough, to even implement a new feature. Another thing that is very much important and very much useful regarding function is code reuse. Now if you have already gone through the code, you see we have used many functions in it, like input is a function, int is a function, print is a function, but we have not actually written its implementation, that how input is going to work, how int is going to work, or how print is going to work. What we have done, we have simply used it. That is the idea of code reuse. You write your code once and then you keep on reusing it, right? So that is the idea behind code reuse. Another thing is debugging. Now debugging and complexity is linked to each other. Now as the program will be divided into smaller units, smaller functions, so that's why if I have to make any particular change to any particular part of the program, that is a function of a program, or even a function is not working properly, it's very easier to debug because it is already properly divided. There is not too much of nestedness between the code, and obviously it is very easy to spot. So that's why debugging can be done. Now debugging is nothing but removing error. So if your code has some sort of an error but it is divided into functions, so because of the less complexity you can easily debug it. And again, code maintenance and implementing new feature becomes easy, and this statement is pretty obvious, right? Because if you have a very large code, it is very hard to maintain it, and at the same time implementing new features can be troublesome because of high level of nestedness, right, in between the code. Now obviously it's not like anything in this world comes without a disadvantage. So the similar thing goes for functions also. So functions also have disadvantages. Now again, this might seem counterintuitive, that okay, in what part we are saying that okay, it reduces complexity, in another part we are saying it adds complexity. Now the idea is pretty simple. Now if you have a very small piece of code, now this example that we are showing over here, it's a very small piece of code, right? So using function is not efficient because in function we actually use the idea of a stack. So it has to be allocated to the memory and then called from there, right? So because of that, it adds extra complexity, and obviously it makes the program slower. Why? Because again, as I mentioned, it implements a stack memory idea where you are going to copy your function into the stack, and then from the stack it gets executed and the result gets returned to the stack, and in this way the overall process gets a bit slow. Again, these disadvantages can be overlooked because of the huge advantages, the benefits that it offers us. So obviously that is why we study, and that is why we use function. So does it make sense? So again, if you go through the block, the language is very simple and lucid and very much intuitive. So I guess you'll understand it very easily. Now here is how to use a function. Now obviously in this section we will talk about the syntax, and we'll talk about how we are going to actually write it. So we'll also see an example. So first is the defining a function, the syntax. So def keyword has to be used. Then function name. Now the function name basically is nothing but an identifier. So the way you declare a variable, the similar rules are being also followed in a function. So the identifier rules are, as you remember, it cannot start with a number, it cannot start with or it cannot have special characters in it like hash, at the rate. This cannot be included, right? So those nomenclature has to be followed. And then we have a parameter list. Now parameter list actually is not mandatory, it's optional. If you want to give, fine. If you don't want to give, no problem. But it's a very powerful feature. It allows us to provide values for these statements for some sort of an operation from the outside, right? And obviously these parentheses are very much important. An opening parenthesis and a closing parenthesis is required, and a colon, right? And after that we have something called as a docstring, which is also optional, but docstring helps in the documentation. So I'll show you how it actually gets executed when we actually go through the coding process. And obviously we'll have statement. Now these statements are mandatory. That means your function must have at least one statement. And if you are not aware of any particular implementation as of now, that is, maybe you will do it later on, then you can use pass keyword, then also it will work. And we also have a mechanism of returning. So imagine if you want to get some sort of value from your function that will be utilized by some other operation. In that scenario, a print statement will not work. The value has to be returned. So let's see it in action. So this program, we will try to write it in a function. So I'll just write the sum function first, which is pretty simple. So obviously we'll use def keyword, then the name of the function. So I'll write like sum n for maybe new or something. So we'll take two numbers because we are adding. So again, there is no restriction. As many numbers, as many parameters you want, you can take, no problem with that. So I'll just take another, and we'll put colon, which is required. And this part, as you can see, indent is very much required. So we do remember indent can either be done by using a tab or 4 spaces. This is very much important because this symbolizes that the statements that are going to be followed belongs to this particular function. If we don't do that, then the idea of belongingness doesn't work. So obviously I'll indent it, and I'll write some sort of a docstring like this function adds 3 numbers, right? And again, it must have three quotes should be there, right? Now if you want, you can add multiple statement also. So we'll do that. We'll just give a good deal of information because it is docstring and it gives information, right? So we do remember that. So it takes 3 numbers. So we'll make it very simple, right? And after that we'll just put sum is equal to a plus b plus c, and as of now we'll just simply print it, print sum, right? This is done. So this is the simple function. So we are following the syntax. So def keyword is there, name of the function, parameter list, parenthesis is there, colon, then we have added docstring, which is optional but is always helpful. Then these are 2 statements. One statement is actually a variable declaration, and we are performing an operation assigning to that variable, and then we are printing it, right? Now let us execute it. As you can see, nothing happens. Why? Because unless and until we call the function, it is going to be of no use. So we'll call it sum of n and parenthesis. Now we have to pass the argument. Remember that this particular function takes 3 arguments, right? So I have to provide 3 arguments, 10, 20 and 30, right? And now if I execute it, obviously I'll get my answer, which is 60. Does it make sense? So that is how a function in its most simplest form works. Now let us see the usefulness of the docstring. So if I write help and it I pass sum n, so as you can see, a good deal of information is being given to us. Here the name of the function is given, the list of the arguments is given, and the docstring that this function adds 3 number and it takes obviously 3 numbers. And so it was just a large example. And obviously help on function, which is in the module main, all these details have been given. So if we don't have that, so this particular basic information will not be given to us, right? And it is always a good practice to write some sort of a documentation to the code, because later on it will be very much easier for us to handle. Does it make sense? So this is a very simple example. Now let us experiment with return statement. Now let's see what happens if we put return of sum. Now a return of sum actually, so code is fine. What it will actually do, it will not print the statement, it will actually have to be assigned to something, like val is equal to sum. So whatever value or whatever the answer this particular function evaluates will be stored in val, and then we can actually use this val for anything. So I'll just remove the statement. I'll write val. Let's see what val gives us. Print val, and if we execute, obviously we get 60, but as we have stored it in a variable, so we can do any kind of operation on, like print val times 2, so we can raise it to some sort of a power 3600. So this was a basic introduction about functions, right? So we discussed about why do I need a function, what is a function, and how to use it. So this was a very basic introduction. And again, go to the blog post. It's written in a very lucid format, and I think it will make sense to all of us. Idea of function calling. So we talked about defining a function. So this part was all about defining. So you have to define a function. If it's a new function, you have to define it, and obviously if it's a function that exists in the standard library or in some other module, then obviously you don't have to define it, you can just simply use it. But if it's a function that you are creating, then you have to define it. First step is that, and the second step is calling the function, and that is what we have done in here. We have called the function. So unless and until we call the function, the value or the statements inside the function is not going to execute, and we are not going to get any kind of an operation out of it, right? So does it make sense? So the details have been given, and obviously a simple example is also given in here with proper comments and documentation. So I hope it makes sense, right? So if you have any problems, so do write in the comments and I'll get back to you. And I think you liked the video, so hit that like button and do subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.